It was the kind of smell had grown so accustomed to that she no longer noticed it, the lamb slow cooking in the kitchen, the dried lavender she hung above the door frames every spring, and beneath it all, something older and harder to name, something that lived in the silences between sentences at the dinner table, something that tightened the air whenever her mother looked at her with that particular expression, half pity, half apology, as though were a problem that had refused, stubbornly and inconveniently, to solve itself. She was 28 years old. In the language of their small county, that translated simply to "left behind." Stood at the kitchen window while the others gathered in the dining room, their voices layering over one another like music played in the wrong key. She could hear laugh, bright and deliberate, designed to fill rooms. She could hear measured tones, each word chosen to remind everyone present that she had a husband now, and therefore an opinion worth hearing. She could hear Lily's giggles, punctuating the conversation like small, harmless explosions. And she could hear, in the spaces between all of it, the particular silence of Rose, who always seemed on the verge of saying something important and never quite arrived there. Dried her hands on the linen cloth, straightened her collar, and walked into the dining room. The conversation did not pause for her entry. It never did. "I simply think," was saying, adjusting the ring on her finger, a habit she had developed since her engagement, a kind of unconscious advertisement, that a woman who does not make an effort cannot then complain about the result. No one said's name, no one needed to. Their mother set down the serving dish and smiled the smile she reserved for moments of performed neutrality. "Dear, that's rather a broad statement." "Is it?" Reached for the bread. "I only mean that there are choices available to everyone. Some of us simply choose differently." Nodded with the gravity of a woman dispensing wisdom from a great height. "Always says that a woman's warmth is her greatest introduction. Men do not approach cold women." "I am not cold," said. She said it plainly, without heat, the way one corrects a factual error. The table shifted almost imperceptibly, smiled. "No one said you were." "You implied it." "I implied nothing. I made a general observation," tilted her head, "though if the shoe fits." It was Rose, barely audible, eyes fixed on her plate. Glanced at her youngest sister with a look of mild amusement and said nothing more, because she didn't need to. The point had been planted. It would grow on its own, the way those things always did, rooting quietly into the evening until could feel it pressing against her chest from the inside. Their mother cleared her throat. "I only wonder," she began, in the careful tone she used when she wanted to say something she knew she shouldn't, "whether you might consider attending the social next month. Mrs. mentioned her nephew is visiting from." "No, thank you," said. "You haven't heard the full." "I have heard enough of Mrs. nephews to last me several lifetimes." Lily covered her mouth with her napkin, even pressed her lips together against a smile. For a brief, fragile moment they were all just sisters at a table, then said, softly, almost gently, which was somehow worse than cruelty, "It's only that we worry, you must understand that. We only say these things because we love you." Looked at her sister, at the careful sympathy arranged across beautiful face like furniture placed to impress visitors. "I know," said, and she smiled, and she reached for her glass, and she said nothing else for the remainder of the meal. Later, alone in the kitchen with the washing up, allowed herself one tear. Just one. She had made that rule years ago and she kept it with the same discipline she applied to everything, her reading, her garden, her correspondence, her carefully maintained inner life that none of them ever thought to ask about. She had not always been the subject of their concern. There had been a time she was 23, and a man named Hatch had presented himself with her mother's enthusiastic endorsement when she might have solved the problem entirely. Was prosperous, moderately handsome, and possessed of a laugh that made her feel, inexplicably, like a window being closed. She had declined him after 2 months of courtship. Her family had not entirely forgiven her for it. She did not regret it. Not even now, standing at the kitchen basin with soap on her hands and voice still ringing faintly in her ears. She had made a decision, years ago and in the clearest part of herself. She would rather be alone forever than loved poorly. She whispered it now, not dramatically but practically, like reminding herself of a fact she occasionally needed to revisit. I would rather be alone forever than loved poorly. The word was still drying on her lips when her father appeared in the kitchen doorway, waving a cream envelope with an expression of genuine excitement. A rare enough thing that turned fully from the sink. "Came this afternoon," he said, holding it out. "From Manor." Took it, she read it once then again. The Duke of requested the pleasure of the family's company at a grand autumn ball, to be held at Manor on the 14th of October. From the dining room she heard his voice rise sharply as their father delivered the news. The Duke is having a ball." Set the invitation on the counter. Outside in the last light, her garden was still and silver. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she dried her hands, folded the cloth neatly, and said to no one in particular, to herself, to the quiet kitchen, to whatever instinct had just stirred awake inside her chest, "I think I will go." Manor did not look like a house. It looked like an argument, a grand, unapologetic statement made in stone and light against the quiet darkness of the countryside, as though the building itself refused to be modest about what it was. Stepped down from the carriage and simply looked at it for a moment. Torches lined the long approach, their flames bending slightly in the October wind. Every window glowed. Music drifted from somewhere deep inside the walls, strings, low and elegant, threading through the cold air like something alive. Around her, other guests moved toward the entrance in clusters of silk and perfume and anticipation, and stood briefly still among all of it, neither intimidated nor dazzled, simply present. "Do close your mouth, Lily," said, sweeping past, "and do try not to linger at the edges all evening." Followed without answering. Inside, the ballroom was a masterpiece of controlled excess. Chandeliers descended from vaulted ceilings in cascades of candlelight, throwing warm gold across the marble floors, and the 100 assembled faces tilted upward in involuntary admiration. The music was louder here, fuller, wrapping itself around conversation and laughter and the soft percussion of dancing shoes. It was, admitted privately, genuinely beautiful. She had worn the deep blue gown. It was 3 years old and she knew it, but it fit her well, and her father had once told her, turned her eyes extraordinary. Had glanced at it on the staircase at home and said, with a smile like a paper cut, "How classic of you." Had thanked her and meant it in an entirely different direction. The sisters dispersed almost immediately upon entering, located her husband's social circle with the efficiency of a general reading a battlefield. Lily attached herself to a group of young women near the refreshments. Watched this with quiet interest, positioned herself at a precise angle near the room's most trafficked corridor, calculated to ensure maximum visibility to anyone of importance entering from the main hall. Drifted, not aimlessly, she never did anything aimlessly, but thoughtfully, taking the room in without needing to be taken in by it. She accepted a glass of wine from a passing tray. She exchanged pleasantries with Mrs. from the village, who smelled of and talked exclusively about her own health. She watched two young men argue passionately near the fireplace about something neither of them understood. She felt, as she often did in large gatherings, simultaneously present and invisible, a sensation she had long since stopped finding painful and had begun, quietly, to prefer. It was the heat of the room that drove her out. That and something else, a restlessness she couldn't name, a feeling of something held just at the edge of her peripheral vision. She set her glass down, slipped through a side door she had noticed near the east wall, and stepped into the night. The garden stopped her entirely. It was enclosed by low stone walls, lit only by the moon and the faint overflow of light from the manor's windows, and it was extraordinary. Structured but not rigid, roses climbed iron frames with the look of something that had been guided rather than forced. Late-season blooms held on stubbornly against the October cold, moved toward them without deciding to, her fingers finding the edge of a leaf, her eyes moving across the varieties with the unconscious fluency of someone who had spent years learning this particular language. Then she saw it, in the far corner almost hidden against the wall. A climbing rose she recognized immediately, pale cream, small-petted, the canes long and arching. She had only ever read about this variety. She had never seen one living, growing, real. She leaned closer and murmured to herself, barely audible, the Latin name. "You know that variety." The voice came from behind her, quiet, unhurried, with a quality of genuine curiosity that distinguished it immediately from the rehearsed warmth of ballroom conversation. Straightened and turned. The man standing at the garden entrance was tall, dark-eyed, dressed with the kind of understated formality that costs more than ornamentation. He was younger than she might have expected from the voice, perhaps 30, perhaps a year or two beyond, with a face that was serious in its natural resting state, as though thinking were its default occupation. He was looking at her, not with the appraising calculation she had learned to recognize in men at social events, but with something simpler and more disarming. Actual interest. "I know it from books," said. "I've never seen one in person. It's rarer than most people realize." He moved toward the rose slowly, standing beside her at a respectful distance. "My groundskeeper sourced it from a grower in the north. It took 3 seasons to establish properly." He paused. "Most guests walk past it without noticing." "Most guests aren't looking." He turned to look at her then. She met his gaze evenly, without performance. They talked for an hour. She did not know in that hour who he was. He did not offer it and she did not ask, and the absence of that information was, she would reflect later, precisely what made the conversation possible. They talked about the rose and then about gardens more broadly, about the particular patience required to grow something that would not be rushed. They talked about books. He had read widely and thought carefully and disagreed with her twice, which she found immediately more interesting than agreement would have been. They talked about solitude, whether it was chosen or assigned, and what the difference felt like from the inside. At some point, the music from the ballroom shifted into something faster. Neither of them moved toward it. "You don't enjoy balls," he said. It was not a question. "I don't enjoy performances," she corrected gently. "I don't mind dancing." Something moved briefly across his face, not quite a smile, but the architectural decision to allow one. "Then I hope," he said carefully, "that you'll save me one." Inside the ballroom had finally secured a position within speaking distance of what she'd been told was the Duke's personal circle. She was mid-sentence, something charming, she was certain, when a subtle shift moved through the crowd near the eastern entrance. Heads turned. Conversations dropped half a register. She looked. The man she had been orbiting all evening, the one whose name kept being spoken in low, significant tones, was walking back into the ballroom, tall, dark-eyed, composed. And beside him, unhurried and blue-gowned and entirely unaware of the architecture of the moment she had just walked into, was. Stopped speaking mid-sentence, the words simply ceased. The man, the Duke, she now understood with a cold clarity, crossed the floor. Past the assembled circle, past every carefully positioned woman in the room. He stopped in front of who had just registered where she was and what was happening, and he bowed with the full formality of a man making a public statement. "I believe," said Lord, loud enough for the ring of witnesses around them, "that this dance was meant for you." Looked at him, looked at the room, looked its face drained of all its careful and at gripping her husband's arm and at Lily with her hand pressed to her mouth. She did not smile triumphantly. She did not look to her sisters for their reaction. She looked only at, and in his eyes she found the same man from the garden, unhurried, genuine, watching her with that simple and devastating interest. She placed her hand in his. They danced, and when the music slowed and the evening gathered itself toward its close, and the family stood near the entrance preparing to depart, Held's hand at the threshold and turned, deliberately, without, to face the small assembled audience of her family. He said 4 words. He said them quietly and absolutely, the way one states something that has already been decided. "I love her," he said. Did not apologize. She did not deflect or diminish or look away. For the first time in more years than she could accurately count, she stood in the full weight of being seen, and she let it hold her. The house was a different kind of quiet the morning after the ball. Not the usual quiet, the comfortable, unremarkable silence of a household settling into its routines. This was the quiet of people who had witnessed something they had not yet found language for, felt it the moment she came downstairs. The kitchen was warm, the kettle already boiling, and yet no one was speaking. Her mother sat at the table with both hands wrapped around her cup, staring at a fixed point on the tablecloth as though the answer to something were printed there in very small text. Lily had not yet appeared, had left at dawn with her husband, which was itself a kind of statement. Rose sat near the window with a book open in her lap, but her eyes were not moving across the page. Only was standing. She was at the counter when entered, and she turned with the careful, coiled energy of someone who had been rehearsing. "I want to understand," said, not sharply, which was almost more unsettling. "What did you say to him?" "Move to the kettle, good morning." Her voice tightened. The entire county was there. There were women, accomplished, beautiful, eligible women, and he walked past all of them, past me, and chose you. So I am asking sincerely what you said. Poured her tea. She considered the question honestly, the way she considered all things, without performance and without cruelty. "We talked about a rose," she said. Stared at her. A rose. A climbing rose. Rare variety cream. It grows in the East Garden. The silence that followed was long enough to be its own kind of answer. Watched something move across her sister's face, the frustration first, then something slower and more complicated. Something that looked, if you knew where to look, remarkably like understanding. "I was myself," added quietly. "That is the complete answer. I did not plan it. I did not position myself or rehearse or want anything from him. I simply was." Looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked away, out the window, at the garden their eldest sister had tended for years, while the rest of them had barely noticed it was there. "I have not been kind to you," said. She said it the way someone removes a splinter quickly, because hesitation only makes it worse. "No," agreed, "you haven't." "I was afraid." The admission seemed to cost her something real. "You were always so settled, inside yourself, and I didn't understand it. It frightened me, so I made it into a flaw." Set down her cup. She crossed the kitchen and stood beside her sister at the window, both of them looking out at the garden catching the early light. She did not offer false comfort. She did not say it's all right because it had not entirely been, and deserved the honesty of that. But she reached out and briefly pressed her hand over her sister's and said nothing, and the nothing was enough. Their mother made a sound from the table, a small, compressed sound that contained a great deal. Looked at her. Her mother's eyes were bright and overfull, her expression a complicated map of emotions too tangled to separate cleanly. Guilt and joy and relief and grief, all occupying the same small space. "I should have said," her mother began. "Don't," said gently. "It's morning, let's just have tea." Came that afternoon. He arrived formally, a calling card delivered ahead, a small bouquet of cream roses from his East Garden, tied simply without flourish. Received him in the sitting room while her family made themselves architecturally scarce in adjacent rooms, close enough to hear the low murmur of conversation without being visible. He sat across from her, and for a moment they simply looked at each other in the ordinary daylight, without moonlit gardens or ballroom grandeur between them, and found that it held. "I want to be straightforward with you," he said. I have been expected to marry strategically my entire adult life. Title, alliance, land, legacy. I understand the machinery of it. I have simply never been willing to become part of it. He paused. Last night was the first time I have spoken to someone who wanted absolutely nothing from me. I didn't know who you were, said. I know, that was precisely it. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the roses on the side table. I want to be equally straightforward. I will not marry to be rescued. I will not accept courtship as a prize or as proof of something to the people in the next room who are absolutely listening right now. She raised her voice only slightly on the last clause. From beyond the wall came the faint, distinct sound of Lily retreating hastily from a doorway. His composure broke just briefly, just enough. The smile was real and it changed his whole face. Then I am not here to rescue you, he said. I am here because I would very much like to continue the conversation we began in the garden. That is all I am asking. To continue. Looked at him, at the careful honesty of him, at the man who had listened to her talk about a rose for an hour and had thought, apparently, that this was time well spent. Then yes, she said, let's continue. Lily came to his room that evening, sitting cross-legged at the foot of the bed the way she had as a small child, her earlier giggling entirely absent. How did you never break, she asked. All those years, the things we said, how did you just hold? Considered this seriously, because Lily was asking seriously and deserved a serious answer. I broke plenty, said. I just didn't let you see it. There is a difference between falling apart and falling apart in public. I gave myself one tear at a time in the kitchen, and then I kept going. Lily absorbed this. That sounds lonely. It was sometimes, paused, but lonely is survivable. Losing yourself to avoid lonely, that is the more dangerous thing. Lily nodded slowly, as though filing something away in a part of herself she was only just discovering existed. Rose appeared in the doorway a few minutes later, quiet as always, hovering at the threshold. She looked at with an expression that had been waiting years to be released. I always admired you, Rose said. I should have said it. I should have said it every time I should have just said it. Held out her hand, Rose crossed the room and took it. Say it next time, told her simply. That's all, just say it next time. 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning when the October light came in low and golden across the garden beds, stood at dawn among her roses with a letter in her hand. It had arrived the evening before, his handwriting, which she was learning to recognize, unhurried and clear, covering 2 pages with observations about a book she had recommended, a question about the climbing rose's winter care, and at the very end, a single sentence that she had read 4 times before setting it down. I find myself thinking about our next conversation before the current one has ended. She folded the letter carefully. She held it against her chest for a moment, eyes closed, feeling the cool morning air and the solid ground beneath her, and the particular sensation of a life beginning to arrange itself. Not around rescue, not around proof, not around the approval of anyone watching from the windows, but around something quieter and more durable. Something chosen. Inside, she could see passing through the kitchen, pausing at the window. Their eyes met briefly through the glass. Did not look away first, and she did not arrange her face into anything careful or calculated. She simply looked at her eldest sister standing in the garden with a letter pressed to her heart, and she smiled, a small, unperformed, genuine smile that asked nothing in return. Smiled back. Then she turned toward the roses, toward the pale morning, toward the long and unwritten days ahead of her, and she began.